Now, from Wichita's most listened to sports radio, 97.5 and 1240 KFH. This is Sports Daily with Jacob Albracht and Tommy Castor.
All right, welcome in, everybody. Sports Daily here on KFH. After a national champion is crowned in the NCAA men's basketball tournament, Jacob Albracht, Tommy Castor with you. Max Power joins us for the next few days, filling in for Jad. We appreciate Max stopping by and hanging out with us here on the show. He'll be manning that KFH hotline for us, which is always available to you at 869-1240. We are looking forward to some pretty good discussions, I think, today. We'll get into last night's championship game. We're going to spend a lot of time on college basketball in general today, as it pertains to that, as it pertains to the future. Kentucky's job is still open. There's a lot of dominoes there and a lot of things to think about and consider when we look at the Kentucky job, and it all sort of ties together with last night's game. We'll talk about the legacy of UConn here, where it stands among things. A lot to get to. We want your comments on it. Again, 869-1240. Tommy, welcome in on this Tuesday. I know it was a late night for all of us last night, staying up to watch that one. Probably not as late as everyone feared, right? We were out of there before 11, I think, and it wasn't too bad, but, late night, I think, for a lot of people either way.
Yeah, it was. And I know, we talked yesterday about what we thought the results were going to be, and I think it really played out, at least the way both you and I thought that it would. Generally speaking, we both thought that UConn would cover. I think we both thought that it was going to be, I think I said 8 points. You said 10. It ended up being 15. So a fairly comfortable win for UConn. Purdue made it interesting early for sure, but then UConn put their foot on the gas and, ultimately won back-to-back natties. And so it's really hard today, the day after, to do anything but tip your cap to what UConn has been able to accomplish over the last two seasons.
Yeah, I think it's annoying. Like, I don't like that. I don't like that it was that predictable, right? That's what's bothered me about this UConn run, is because it's so predictable. And what I love about the NCAA tournament is its unpredictability. And so I'm anti-UConn now. Like, I'm tired of this. I'm done with this. I don't want any more of this. I'm over it. It's not, I think for a lot of people, it will be because they're challenging some of the great legacies, and maybe you're a fan of one of those legacies and all of these things. I mean, I'm going to tell you right now, there is not even close been a better team in the last 25, 30 years than UConn. And we'll get into that in just a minute. And I know that bugs people, and they'll want to spin that, the way that it is. But, if championships matter, it's not particularly close. I happen to think there's more into it than that. That'll be a part of today's discussion, is where does, this program sit right now? Because there are oddities within the success they've had in the NCAA tournament. It's just like, I'm tired of it. I cannot even, the job that they did executing a game plan last night, I mean, it's wild to see that. And you could see it coming. That's why I thought it was so predictable, because you knew what they were going to do. They were going to do everything they could to just run Purdue a lot, which is what I would do. I mean, I can understand that much of it, right? Let's run them and gas them. If their best player is 7 foot tall and, he's not, and he plays every minute, so it's not like his stamina is not high. But if they're going to be a team that, lumbers down and does things that way, well, let's make them not do that. Let's run them. And they did. And basically, UConn said, Zach Edey, you can have yours. We're going to take everything else away. Charles Barkley simplified that for us and said, yeah, well, he's not going to score 70. Just take everything else away. And that's what they did. And they executed it, which is it's one thing to have the game plan. It's another thing for execution. So, both coaching and players deserve a ton of credit for UConn. I can't help but think back to healthy Kansas beating this team and what might have been there. There's all kinds of things that go into it, but UConn was clearly the best team. What's wild to me, and I didn't know this until last night, that's the first number 1 overall seed to win the NCAA tournament in 11 years, since 2013 in Louisville. That's what we love about the NCAA tournament, right? Is the unpredictability of it. UConn was very predictable this year based on what they did last year. Last year, it was kind of fun to see them be dominant as a 4 seed or whatever they were. And, oh, man, look at how good they are. This year, not as fun. Like, that wasn't as fun for me. So I'm tired of it. Dan Hurley plays such a good bad guy. He's such a good heel for the sport. I mean, incredible. He's so good at it that it also adds to the intrigue. And typically, I will say, like, perceived like good guy, bad guy, good versus evil is the best thing you can have from a viewing experience. Not when it's that overwhelmingly, apparent to most of us that UConn's going to win that game. So now we need we need somebody else to step it up here and take that. But for now, it's UConn and it's their world, and we're all just living in it. And I have no idea, like, how much of their roster comes back next year. I don't have a clue. I haven't even looked at that. What's wild about UConn too to me, Tommy, is like there isn't much name brand on that roster. Like when you go and you talk about college basketball players this year and all the great, like, you don't list off UConn. They're such a good team. Everything about UConn are things that we should like. Yet to me, they have become this villain that is so great.
I love it. I don't have an issue with it at all. I like Dan Hurley. I like the energy that he brings. I like the fact that when you look at his background and where he came from, kind of a diamond in the rough. Obviously, he's got the Hurley family name, but the guy was a high school coach for a long time. He was at Rhode Island, for God's sakes, before he came to Connecticut, and has been able to build this juggernaut. And I want to see him stay at UConn. I want to see him be able to build a dynasty because I think it's great. I think it's great for the game. And here's the other thing too. The reason why I like it so much is that typically the team that wins the NCAA tournament, because it is a crapshoot and it can be random at times, sometimes the team that wins the NCAA tournament is not the best team in America. In fact, probably that happens more often than not. Objectively speaking, UConn is the best team in America. There's no debate about it. There shouldn't be.
Well, they were this year. Yeah, for sure.
They shouldn't. They finished not only as national champions, but number one in KenPom. They were the number one team in KenPom. They rolled over every single opponent. And while I think it takes away from the craziness of March Madness for sure, because it was kind of a foregone conclusion that UConn would just win and win comfortably. And I think everybody that said things like, oh, Purdue's going to give them a test and Purdue's going to, take Purdue on the money line and blah, 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 blah.
Purdue was really good.
They were
right?
really
good.
They
were good
all
year.
They were really good. But the body of work from UConn in the tournament is not only are we going to beat you, we are going to dominate you. And they did that every single game in the tournament this year and in the tournament last year. What I like about that is that you basically are crowning this dynasty. You are crowning the deservedly best team in the country to win the greatest prize in the sport in back-to-back years. Dan Hurley, I think for all of his antics, and you know what? I think that he amps it up. I think that he plays it up for the crowd a little bit. I remember going back to, I think it was the very first game in the NCAA tournament this year. They were playing Stetson, and they were up by like 50 points at halftime, it seemed like. And I remember Dan Hurley did an interview going into the locker room, and he was like angry. He was angry with this team's play. He was mad about it. They were winning by, massive margins, and it was 1 versus 16, and he wasn't happy. And I'm like, okay, like this is a different mentality overall. So I like it. I think it's good for the sport. I think it's good to have that team at the very top of the mountain that now everybody is looking at dethroning. It's the same thing that the Chiefs are doing right now in the NFL. They're at the top of the mountain, and everybody wants to pull them down. It's the exact same thing.
Here's why I think it's different. Because the Chiefs play tight games that go to overtime, and they have all this star power and all this stuff. But the problem for me with UConn right now, and it's a little bit of the problem the UConn women faced for a while in women's basketball, when it seems like it's such a foregone conclusion, I don't think that's as good for the sport. Now, it helps establish maybe a bigger picture. I will make a proclamation right now, and it's not earth-shattering. There's no chance that game was as widely viewed as the women's championship game on Sunday.
I know it wasn't. I know. And that's the thing. That's kind of the trade-off. You've got the best team in the country, and they are rolling over opponents, and they're deservedly the NCAA champion. You are lacking a little bit of that intrigue that now women's basketball brought onto the table.
Well, this specific season.
But that's not the fault of UConn.
No, I'm not blaming UConn for that. I just don't. I don't like it.
You're anti-UConn, you're anti-Dan Hurley, all of that. You can't blame them for being good. You can't blame them for beating everybody that's in their path.
I'm not blaming them. I don't like it. I don't think it's as fun as what I'm saying. It doesn't have anything to do with like taking anything away from them. It is incredible what they've done. It's just made the tournament this year a little less exciting because it has felt like, man, nobody's going to beat UConn. Now, had it happened, that would have been amazing. Now you've got this epic all-time story, but it just never at any point in this tournament has felt like anybody was going to beat them. And that's not good. And I think, to go back and compare it to their women's program of about 10 years ago, that was people wonder, like, why aren't more people watching? It's like, because we know UConn's going to win everything. Like, we know the UConn women, they're not getting beat. We know they're going to get beat. I mean, we know they're not going to get beat. And it sort of started to feel that way at points this season with UConn. Like, nobody's beating them. And that's not good for the tournament. Now, that's irrelevant. It's amazing what they've done. I don't have to like it. They play a good bad guy. They have played this role that's going to be great. And it's not going to stretch over a number of years. It just won't. But it has for 2 years, and it's unbelievable that it has.
I'll tell you right now, of course, I grew up a KU fan, and I have been my entire life. If it's not KU next year, I want it to be UConn. I want to see UConn go for 3. Because that doesn't happen. Like, that doesn't happen in modern basketball. Florida won back-to-back in 06 and 07. That sort of thing, because of the way the NCAA tournament is set up, that sort of thing just doesn't happen. And so I'd love to see that happen. And I'd love to see it happen with Dan Hurley. He said after the game that, his biggest priority is putting the roster back together and trying to have as much continuity as possible. And I think that is absolutely the way to continue this on. And that, because it's so hard to do in the transfer portal world and one and dones and things like that, that continuity from year to year, it's working for Dan Hurley. It's a completely different philosophy than, we've seen from guys like John Calipari, for instance, and others. That's worked for Dan Hurley. They've won back-to-back national championships. I think that basically, I don't know if every single program in the country, but I would say the vast majority of programs in the country right now would trade their coach for Dan Hurley. No doubt about it.
Well, we're going to find out, because Kentucky has probably already and needs to make that call first. And we're going to get into the Kentucky job in just a minute, and as it pertains to some things that pertain to teams that we care about. Yeah, it's a great run. I think that he is in the right place. The questions for UConn are eventually going to turn into, can they stay competitive with teams in the power leagues with NIL and, paying their coach and all of those things, trying to play out of the Big East. My guess is they probably can, but we'll see on that. And when we think about UConn now, 6 titles in the last 25 years since 1999, 6 of them. Like, you can just end it there. Oh, Dan Hurley, I guess, by the way, said he's staying at UConn, so maybe that doesn't have interest. We'll get to that. I just saw that. But when we think about this run, 6 titles in 25 years makes it pretty obvious that they've been the most successful college basketball program in the last 2.5 decades, right? There's no question about that. But it does get interesting because they're not always in it, right? They have a lot of years where they're not even good enough to make the tournament. And that's always been interesting with them for me, even before these last 2 titles. It was that way before with Jim Calhoun. Like, you'd go through these years, UConn's in the tournament. Oh man, UConn just won the national title. Is it what year? What were they with Kemba Walker? I don't even remember what seed they were that year.
They were not a high seed that year. I'm
it's
pretty
like,
sure.
There's UConn again. Man, they got another one. How about that? And then Kevin Ollie's year. It's like, oh man, there's UConn again. Like, what happened to that? I forgot about UConn. They've been irrelevant for a couple of years. And I don't think that's going to happen now, but it make like, if we all live and die by this NCAA tournament, which again, I think is fool's gold, I don't think that is a true indicator of the strength of a program. They have been able to navigate this most difficult championship scenario that exists in all of sports, this NCAA tournament with 64 teams, and they've been able to do it 6 times, basically a fourth of the time, 25% of the time they win the national title. That's so ridiculous. but it is what it is. And even before this run with Hurley, they had won 4 of them. So, nobody can really compete with that. I don't know how you stack up that legacy. Because there is something to say about continuity. There is something to say about what Kansas and what Gonzaga have done, right? The consistent, the streak Bill Self had of Big 12 titles. And like, how do you compare those things? Everybody in the world is going to say, well, it's all about championships. And I agree with that. But I also think in a format, and I've said this first, why I think it's ridiculous that Coach Cal got run out of Kentucky. Like, in this sport with this insane format for the way we find the champion, it's more than just that too. You have to take into consideration the regular season and what they did in their conference, because winning the title is just absurd.
Yeah, I don't know
that tournament.
I don't know if I buy that completely, because you go back to, you mentioned Kemba Walker. You go back to that year in 2011. They were a 3 seed, by the way. They won the Big East tournament, but they were 9-9 in their conference that year.
Right.
And they got hot in the postseason. They won the Big East tournament, and then they won the NCAA tournament. They won 11 games in a row. They got hot at the right time. They won the national championship. They were pedestrian in the regular season. They finished that year 32-9. That's a really good win-loss record for that year. But the year before, they were 18-16, and it was relatively disappointing with basically the majority of the same roster. Kemba Walker was on that team, and others. They made it to the Final Four the year before that. That's the thing about Connecticut, about UConn over the years, is like you mentioned, they've been up and down. They're up and down. They are the overall best team in the last 25 years, the best program. National championships will tell you that. 6 in 25 years. What makes it that much more impressive is the fact that they've gotten those 6 titles with 3 different coaches. And, Jim Calhoun is a legend, but Kevin Ollie, I think that everybody can look back on his tenure at UConn. Yeah, he won a national championship, but they were not great a lot of the time that Kevin Ollie was there. Then he left kind of in a cloud of scandal. And of course, Dan Hurley took over and then won 2 more championships. Like, they've been able to overcome, and they've been able to win national championships with 3 different coaches in the last 25 years. That tells you not only is the program overall on extremely solid footing with regardless of the coach, but it also tells you that UConn does a phenomenal job at finding coaches who can win championships. They're able to grab a guy like Dan Hurley from Rhode Island, who had never even sniffed a national championship, but they saw something in him to be able to build this program and win NCAA titles. That's the important thing.
And it's wild too. You remember him saying, what did he say early on? You better get us now.
They lost to Villanova.
We're coming.
They lost to Villanova in, I think it was right before the pandemic. Because he started in 2018 at UConn.
Yeah,
it was in 2020. Better get us now because we're coming. And man, he was right.
So that UConn has been playing basketball for as long as any team in the country, essentially, right? They've had a program since 1901. They're 23rd on the list of all-time wins. Like, this recent success is wild stuff to think about. And we will relate this all, and we're going to go into this Kentucky thing. As Hurley has said, he's not going to Kentucky. You got to think about this. He came from Rhode Island and has become everybody's darling. It's not always about the biggest name. Like, sometimes you just have to find the right coach. And now Kentucky's going through this. And yes, Dan Hurley should be at the top of their list. And no, I don't think he's going to go. And he said as much. But when we think about, like, who Kentucky should hire as the next coach, it's wild to me to think about how those things can happen. And this happens all the time, right? If you look around and see, like, did teams that are really successful get their guy? And I want to say it was Wetzel or Pat Forty or something as it related to the Louisville job. Like, pointed out all these great coaches that were absolutely not the top choice and biggest name of the schools, that ended up hiring them where they've been really successful. And we all act like Kentucky has to be some name somewhere. And Dan Hurley came up from Rhode Island. There weren't very many people outside of his last name that knew who Dan Hurley was when he came to UConn. It's just a good fit. And sometimes I think you need to find just a good fit, like what's going to be good for this program at this time. And it's not always the biggest name, right? It's not always the most obvious name. It's not always some retread to be, brought back in. So what about this Kentucky job? If it's not Hurley and it's not Nate Oates, we find out yesterday, then who? Scott Drew has been the betting favorite for a long time. You and I talked about this for a couple of hours last night as Scott Drew relates to this job. Let's get into it and talk about Kentucky, what that job is. Is it, one of the best jobs? They'll certainly pay the most, certainly has the history, but we'll get into all of it. Your thoughts on the championship last night, 869-1240. We're rolling right on this Tuesday edition of Sports Daily. We want to remind you that mornings at KFH, the staff enjoys a great cup of coffee from Prairie Fire Coffee. Appreciate Prairie Fire for hooking us up and getting us our caffeine fix each and every morning here on our Odyssey family of networks. More on college basketball. What about this Kentucky job now? If Hurley's not it, who is it? That's next on Sports Daily.
Time to get back to the sports talk.
All right, let's do this thing. Go!
Sports Daily is on KFH.
On your way into work and want to keep listening to Sports Daily even after you park the car? With the Odyssey app and Odyssey.com, you can. Just download the app or visit Odyssey.com and search for KFH. You can download the Odyssey app today to get started. We're talking college basketball here. The day after the men's national championship, UConn going back-to-back. One of the, if not the largest coaching jobs now open and still looms as Kentucky navigates through its lists. It is a fascinating job search when things like this happen. We haven't seen one in a very long time because UNC and Duke, who have made recent coaching changes, already had their coaches in place when they made those. So probably since Bill Self at Kansas, have we seen one of the true remaining, blue bloods. That's the thing about UConn. I mean, they hired Dan Hurley. Was that a search like this? No. Are they a blue blood? How can you be the best program in the last 30 years and not be a blue blood? But we never, like when we did this for an hour yesterday talking about Kentucky, we never think of UConn as a blue blood. We don't. We should. I'm not saying they're not. They are.
I do.
But they don't ever get listed. We didn't name them yesterday when we were talking about how this is so rare. UConn just hired a coach. They've hired two coaches in Ollie and Hurley. Like, they've been through this twice now. Are they a blue blood? They clearly are. We just never think about them that way, which is ridiculous because they are. They certainly are.
They
have more titles than Kansas. They have more titles than a lot of these. We never list them off when we're listing blue bloods. It's always Kansas, Kentucky, UNC, Duke, probably UCLA, and then the has-been of Indiana. Those are the teams that get listed as those programs, but UConn's there. But Kentucky feels different. It does feel different. They'll pay their coach a ton of money. It is as storied and rabid a fan base and program as there is in college basketball. And they have a coaching opening that nobody saw coming and nobody expected, by the way. John Calipari's now at Arkansas. They ran him out of town. I think the fans are silly for doing that. I think you always have to be careful what you wish for. But here we go. They need a new coach. They're looking. They've been turned down by Hurley. They've been turned down by Jay Wright. We know those. At least not, I shouldn't say turned down. Hurley will be a turn down. Jay Wright says he's not going to be the coach. So whether they had any real interest there or not, I don't know. I don't know what they're going to be able to do. I don't think sometimes the most obvious answer is the best. Like, I don't think Rick Pitino needs to be the next coach at Kentucky. I think that's ridiculous. I think Billy Donovan is an interesting name, but I think there's as much risk there. Billy Donovan's one of the great college basketball coaches. There's no question. He just chose to go pro out of it. Does Billy Donovan know this era of college basketball? I think there's too much risk in going the old route because the game is changing, right? You don't want to be caught behind. So many older coaches are getting out of the game because they don't like it. So who knows if Billy Donovan would even like college basketball now if he came back to it. I wouldn't come back to college basketball from the NBA, by the way. If I were why would Billy Donovan do that? Hey, would you like to make less money and work 12 months out of the year or have an off season there in the NBA and make just as much money? Like, I don't think anybody's coming down from the pros to take Kentucky. So then what? The odds-on favorite for a long time has been Scott Drew. Nate Oates says he's staying out. Nate Oates has too big of a buyout. I think that's pretty obvious because if they really want Nate Oates, they can go back to Nate Oates when his buyout goes away in a couple of years. They know that. Everybody knows that. That's why Nate Oates probably isn't the coach here. Scott Drew has been the odds-on favorite for a long time. Other notable names in the mix, and these are Bet Online's odds. You've got Kelvin Sampson at 12-1. You've got Sean Miller at 16-1. You've got Chris Beard at 18-1. Richard Pitino is at 7-1. That one's pretty interesting. You've got Will Wade at 25-1, Brad Underwood and Jerome Tang both at 33-1, and then some really established big-time coaches further down the list with even longer odds. If Tommy Castor is in the Kentucky chair, who is at the top of your list? Not who's the odds-on favorite. Who's at the top of your list? If you could cherry pick it, and we know now it's not Hurley, who would it be?
Probably Nate Oates at number one for me. But that buyout again is prohibitive. And so I understand, he put out a statement last night saying he was staying at Alabama. I'm sure it was just basically Kentucky saying, look, we love you. We think you're great. We're not going to pay. I think it's $18 million for a buyout. That's triple the highest buyout ever paid in college basketball. Like nobody's ever paid a buyout more than $5 or $6 million in college basketball. Nate Oates is $18 million. That's the biggest reason why Kentucky wasn't going to fire John Calipari.
But this is Kentucky.
At least this year.
It's Kentucky.
No, I get it. I'm just saying that you've got to balance the desire to have a coach like Nate Oates,
sure,
with that buyout. Okay, so that would be at the very top of my list. I think he'd probably be number one. I think as far as a pie in the sky, like reach for the moon type grab, it'd be Jay Wright, I think, because of the success that he had at Villanova. Of course, I'm not even including Dan Hurley in this because I don't think Dan Hurley ever.
Well, you don't have to. You don't have to include Jay Wright either. Jay Wright says he's not taking the job, so
then
he's out.
You get those three out of the way. For me, it's Scott Drew. It's bottom line. It's Scott Drew, and that's the reason. I mean, I think that he's got the chops to be able to coach at Kentucky. I think he's done a phenomenal job in his 20+ years at Baylor. He's 53, so he's got some time ahead of him. So it wouldn't just be a placeholder type position where Rick Pitino would be. If you bring him back, he'd only be there for a couple of years, probably before he retires. So I do think that it's probably Scott Drew. I do want to say, and I know we're talking about the coaching search and all of that, but you mentioned something at the very top of this that I want to react to. You mentioned the fan base running John Calipari out of town and how you think that they were crazy to do that. I think that because of what we saw last night from UConn and because of what we've seen in the last 25 years from UConn, winning 6 titles in 25 years, the fan base at Kentucky, they were absolutely right to run John Calipari out of town. Because if UConn, under 3 different coaches in 25 years, can win 6 championships, then John Calipari can absolutely win more than 1 in 15 years. Doesn't mean that John Calipari is not a Hall of Fame coach. Doesn't mean he's not a great coach, one of the all-time greats. That's all true. It's all well and good. But for Kentucky as a blue blood, it's about winning NCAA championships. Bottom line, full stop. And John Calipari won 1 in 15 years. So I get the reason why this wasn't going to work long-term. The philosophies that John Calipari has for a while meshed well with Kentucky, or at least Kentucky fans were able to swallow it. But when you're getting bounced early in the NCAA tournament, that doesn't work for Kentucky. It just doesn't. And so they need to have a coach that is willing to do everything to win national championships and have that be the number one priority. It wasn't for John Calipari.
Should Kansas have the same standards as Kentucky?
I think that they should absolutely be up there, and Bill Self has won 2 in the last 15 years.
He's won 1 in the last 17 years, right? He won in 2007-8, and he won in 21-22. So if you go to the last 17 years, he's won a championship, 1.
Yeah, I'm talking about like over the overall body of work. He's won multiple championships. Now, if we were talking about if 2022 didn't happen, and Bill Self only has the 2008 championship on his resume, then yeah, I think at that point, and believe me, being around KU conversations, absolutely being around KU conversations over the years, the conversation and the narrative typically is Bill Self is outstanding. He's great. He's amazing. He needs to win. They need to win more championships. That was the same knock on Roy Williams at Kansas for 15 years. He took him to Final Fours. He took him to national championship games. He couldn't win a championship. And that was it's always something when you look back at Roy Williams at Kansas, it was amazing, phenomenal, fantastic coach, didn't win championships. So, I do think that those standards and expectations are probably about the same for both universities.
Yeah, and I think they're ridiculous if that's the standard. I don't believe that Kansas fans feel that way about Bill Self.
I'm telling you they do. I'm telling you that if 2022 hadn't happened, there would be conversations about how Bill Self is phenomenal, a Hall of Fame coach and all of that, but he needs to win more championships. Absolutely, that would be the conversation.
You have Elite Eights, 4 times for Calipari, a championship, 3 Final Fours. And I think I'm one off on all of those, actually. I think you've got, you went Elite Eight, Final Four, national championship. and then NIT, then a championship loss, another Final Four, an Elite Eight 2 years later, a Sweet 16 the year after that, then another Elite Eight, then the COVID year, then their bad season, and then 3 straight trips to the NCAA tournament in which they had bad opening weekend losses. That's the resume for Calipari. It is insane to say that
it's
is
not
not
a
good
bad.
enough.
It's not a bad resume. I'm just saying
It's an incredible resume.
Through the lens of the blue blood Kentucky program, you are there to win national titles. Bottom line, it doesn't matter how many people you are putting into the NBA. It doesn't matter how many NCAA tournaments you go to or how many Sweet 16s you go to.
So
what's
what's the number?
Let's
how
compare,
many championships
okay,
do you need in 15 years?
Let's compare real quick. Mark Few at Gonzaga. You love bringing up Mark Few at Gonzaga. Okay. He's had an incredible career at Gonzaga and he's done great things. Hasn't won a championship, but that's okay for Gonzaga. Gonzaga's not a blue blood. That's why he's been able to stay there forever. And the fan base is generally like, yeah, he's the best coach we've ever had, taking the program to new heights. That's why Wichita State, when Greg Marshall took the Shockers to a Final Four, that's why everybody's like, this is amazing. Like and they loved him. They put him up on a pedestal. It's different at Kentucky. You are there to win national titles and contend for them every single year. And by the way, it's been 13 years, 12 years since he won a national title. I can absolutely understand the fan base and the donor base getting kind of antsy about that.
You're making my case right now as to why Scott Drew should not take that job. You just made my entire argument as why Scott Drew shouldn't take that job.
I think Scott Drew would absolutely be great in that role. I think that would be.
But so what is the number? How many titles does Scott Drew need to win in 10 years to be good enough at Kentucky?
I think that if you go to a place like Kentucky and you've got the chops of Scott Drew, I think that you probably ought to win. You ought to at least win 1, if not 2, in 10 years. That's probably, I think, a general expectation. Shot in the dark I would say.
But 1 in 13 was not good enough for Cal. You just said that. So you can't say 1 in 10 is going to be good enough for Scott Drew.
1 in 15 for Calipari.
Yeah, but he won it. He won it in 2011.
Yeah, I'm talking about his overall tenure at Kentucky.
His overall body of work before that was an Elite Eight and a Final Four. But in the last 13 years, he's won 1 national championship. So in 13, okay, so let's say he was there 15 years.
Okay,
How many titles?
Scott Drew has won a championship in the last 4 years.
Right.
In the last 4 years.
And if you're going an entire body of work, he's won 1 over what? He's been there 21 years.
At Baylor,
right?
where that program was further down than you could ever go.
So again, in 15 years, is it you have to win 2 championships in 15 years to be good enough at Kentucky? Is that the answer?
I think you need to be a legitimate contender for a national championship. Every single year. And you need to probably win.
How many championships?
In 10 years?
In 15 years. How many championships?
2. At least 2.
You think he'll do that?
I think that he would have a better chance to do that at Kentucky than he will at Baylor. 100%.
How many coaches at Kentucky have won 2 championships in 15 years?
I know Tubby Smith didn't. He won 1, and he was ran out of town for 1 in his tenure. Billy Gillespie wasn't there long enough to be able to do anything. That was only a couple of years. How long was
Rick Pitino?
Rick Pitino there. Rick Pitino won
1 in a decade,
right,
basically.
1 in 10. Adolph Rupp won multiple championships, obviously.
Right. Yeah, we're going back too far with Adolph Rupp. To the 70s. My point is, this standard that we've created for Kentucky, nobody's met it. So has no coach been good enough at Kentucky?
We're not creating.
No,
this is what it is. We're not creating anything. This is the reality. It's been created. It's already been there.
Okay, maybe that's the case. That's exactly why we got to pause. We're going to continue. This is where we wanted to go with this today. So if that's the reality, if the standard is you have to win a couple of titles in 15 years, right, which no program does except for UConn and maybe, UNC I think has probably
Duke
hit
did.
that threshold, but hasn't recently, right? It's been a minute that they haven't recently. Kansas certainly hasn't. So is Kentucky, a long time ago they did. We were right. And their coach left. I don't know that we're holding, but my point is, what program around the country has that same standard? Maybe none do, but that would be a reason I would pause
Didn't
at that
Villanova
job.
do that too?
I don't know. We'll go back and look. Yeah, I think so. I think they got 2 of them. Yeah, but those coaches left. They weren't run out of town. It's a little bit different because of that. If Cal got run, I think we can all agree Cal got run out of town. We'll come back. We'll continue the conversation as it pertains to Scott Drew, and then we'll look at some of the other names on the list as the direction Kentucky ought to go. Not what they will do, but maybe what they should do. It's a great conversation. 869-1240 is the number to call for you to chime in on it. ESPN Bet, by the way, ready to take you through all the huge sports moments this spring. The exclusive sports book of ESPN has it all, including exclusive offers and promotions from Scott Van Pelt and Stephen A. Smith. From the playoff intensity to getting on the links and out to the ballpark, there's no better time to be sports fans. Sign up today. New users get $100 in bonus bets for making any sportsbook bet. Download ESPN Bet today. What a play. Must be 21 plus. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. In partnership with Hollywood Casino at Kansas Speedway. Terms and conditions apply. See the app for details. Maybe it's time to start looking at some odds for next year's champion. I believe UConn is about 18-1 right now. If you're wondering about any baseball betting, Royals fans, by the way, the Royals begin a big series with the Astros tonight. They're plus money at home with Cole Reagans on the bump, plus 110. What do you think about that? ESPN Bet, you can find it all. We'll be back. More Sports Daily right after this.
commercials are over.
No, I haven't got all day.
869-1240.
Time to get busy.
This is Sports Daily on KFH.
All right, quick segment here brought to you by Crestview Country Club, and we'll continue this discussion as we move into hour number 2. Who should Kentucky hire? What is the standard there? How should that relate to the hiring process? We're just sort of opening the can into it. Tommy thinks John Calipari did not do a good enough job. I certainly think he did do a good enough job, and we'll see what they get moving forward. You know, one of the things about hiring a new coach is you have to replace that coach. So how far down the list do you go before it feels like maybe it was a mistake to run him out? And no, we got to be fair too. They didn't, the administration didn't run him out of town. They gave him another chance because they didn't want to buy him out, but the fans ran him out. He left. He left for Arkansas. He was tired of it. And I don't blame him, by the way. And I'm not a Cal guy either. So don't try to spin this.
You've been a John Calipari apologist the entire week.
No, but I'm not. That's what really bothers me about this. I think he's done a good enough job at Kentucky. I am not a Cal apologist. I don't think one way or the other about John Calipari. I know he's polarizing. I don't feel it either way. We mentioned this is a segment brought to you by Crestview Country Club. Big pool out there at Crestview will be opening pretty soon here. You and I are both out there. We've talked about the golf. I'll tell you that our family, Tommy, uses it for the pool. Probably more than anything else, one of the better pools in town that I've seen. I'm ready for pool season. We got sunshine yesterday. I'm sick of the smoke in the air. I'll tell you that. We survived the wind of the weekend. Yesterday was beautiful, and I'm like, oh man, we are almost there. We're almost there. All these trees are going to be green. It's going to be good enough to go to the pool. At Crestview, it's temperature controlled. So even if it's not super warm outside, you get in there and they warm up the water for you. But it's time. I'm done with the winter.
Yeah, we're going to get a taste of it. Mother Nature's going to tease us a little bit this weekend. I think temperatures like up in the 80s this weekend.
Yeah.
But, of course, it's still too early to actually open the pool, so I'll just be, I don't know, probably sitting out in my backyard just wishing and dreaming that I was at the pool out at Crestview. Because once it does open up, I mean, man, it's incredible. And I know both you and I and our
the kids down with a hose.
Yeah, you and I and our families during the summer, we spend quite a bit of time out there, on the weekends, or I know
my wife and kids.
My wife will take our kids there during the week, just to hang out and have a good time. So it's perfect, to be right there and just enjoy that during the summer.
I also melt, right? Like I'm a little reflective to the sun. So my wife and kids, they'd be content to be out there literally every day. I'm not quite to that level. At some point I get hot and whatever, but I do enjoy it. So give Crestview a call if you want to check out that pool. They'll show it to you. It's awesome. All right. So when we come back, we're going to continue this discussion. I don't think we're going to get anywhere with it necessarily, but I do think it is fascinating that this job has opened up under the circumstances that it has opened up. It's not some slam dunk, right, that it needed to be opened up. I think that's a point of debate. What they need to do with the next coach is a point of debate. And what coaches should be willing to take the job is a point of debate, quite frankly. And we'll get into that. If Scott Drew was their choice and they called him, should he take the job? We don't agree on that either. We'll begin to discuss that a little bit. And I do think it's unique to him and a couple other guys. I'll give you my reasons why I wouldn't do it if I were him. I'm not going to say he should or he shouldn't because I don't know Scott Drew. I've never talked to Scott Drew. But if I were him, what would I do? We'll get into that. It's Sports Daily. It's hour number 2, 869-1240. You can chime in. Max Power, man in that KFH hotline for us. We'll come back more right after this.
Live Out Loud Mornings with Now, from Wichita's most listened to sports radio, 97.5 and 1240 KFH. This is Sports Daily with Jacob Albracht and Tommy Castor.
All right, welcome back in, everybody, to another hour of Sports Daily, hour number 2. Appreciate you being with us, 869-1240 if you want to chime in. We're trying to get to and sort through this Kentucky job. We are clearly on the opposite end of whether the job should be open in the first place. It is, though, and now we wonder who the next coach will be. We know it will not be Dan Hurley. We know it will not be Jay Wright. We know it will not be Nate Oates. I think whether or not those guys were at the top of Kentucky's list, we'll never know officially. I suspect that at least Hurley and Oates were. So then you go further down. And we've mentioned some of the names. Tommy gave you his as we sort of make our way through. So Scott Drew is at the top of Tommy's list. Let's spend some time with Scott Drew, and then I'll tell you who'd be at the top of my list. Scott Drew's an interesting case. Scott Drew's young. I think that his case is unique for me. And I don't know him. I don't know who Kentucky wants. I don't know any of that stuff. So we're just trying to guess at this thing. And if I'm Scott Drew, I wouldn't take the Kentucky job. He's going to get paid at Baylor close enough for me. And again, and this is just if it was me. And the reason and let me also clarify that there are two guys that fit this profile to me, maybe three. Certainly Scott Drew, Mark Few, maybe Kelvin Sampson, although I think his is a little unique too. But for certain, to me, if I'm Scott Drew and Mark Few, I don't touch the Kentucky job. Everybody else, I probably would. But I wouldn't if I were those two, because those two, to me, have built places. They're the guys, right? They didn't follow anybody else in there or anything like that. These two are responsible for building two of the real powerhouses in college basketball right now. We talk about blue bloods, and that goes over, a century and everything. But if we're talking about modern blue bloods, the programs that fit that profile right now, maybe not historically, Baylor and Gonzaga are both programs like that to me. Perennial powers, perennially in the tournament, winning tournament games, a top seed in the tournament just about every year. They're already there, and they built it themselves. To me, there's just about nowhere to go but down. If the standard at Kentucky is 2 titles in 15 years, I just think that's such an unreasonable standard. If I'm one of those two guys, that I wouldn't do it. Because there is, to me, appeal in being somewhere forever. There is appeal in building something yourself. You're not following anybody else. This success was self-built. I don't think either of those coaches have a better chance to win a title at Kentucky than they have at Baylor or Gonzaga. I think they're getting the same caliber players. So at that point, what difference does it make? And so at that point, you're just trying to go, and maybe money talks, and you can be the highest paid there because they probably will pay the next coach the most money. But if you're just chasing the legacy of being at Kentucky, that's fine. But to me personally, I'd rather have what I built myself and try to win titles there, because I don't think that going to Kentucky gives Mark Few or Scott Drew a better chance to win a national championship. So if I'm those two guys, I'm not interested in the job. If I'm anybody else, I probably am. That's where we're at odds too, because you think Scott Drew, if you were Scott Drew, you would absolutely be interested in that job.
Yep.
And it's interesting to think about him specifically, as he is the odds-on favorite. Odds makers have him as even money to take that job. That is an overwhelming favorite to take that job. So then it becomes, would he take that job if they offer it to him? And I do think that's an interesting discussion to have. Scott Drew to Kentucky, you think he should?
I think he absolutely should. And the reason for that is twofold, I think. And maybe there might even be more reasons than just the two I'm thinking about. I think number one, it's absolutely, like we talked about before, incredible what he's done at Baylor, pulling them out of the depths of despair. It was so bad for them 20 years ago when he took that job, turned them into a legitimate program, a Big 12 contender, a perennial NCAA tournament contender, and a national champion. They won the national championship a couple of years ago. He's been there for 20 plus years. He's 53. He's at the very top of the mountain at Baylor. That's great. It's wonderful. It's not taking anything away from Baylor. It's not taking anything away from his accomplishments. There might be a part of him that thinks, I've done everything I can do at Baylor. There's literally nothing more that I can do. I can win more championships, absolutely. But this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. A blue blood program like Kentucky doesn't come open very often. The last time one of these programs legitimately had a coaching search was 2009 when John Calipari took the Kentucky job. North Carolina.
It was Dan Hurley. Remember, we already went through that.
Okay. So excluding UConn.
Isn't that wild, though?
The
Hang on, is it
traditional,
quick? Because I did the same thing, too. Isn't that crazy about UConn? As a quick aside, like, that's wild. We all do. I absolutely do that, by the way.
I get it. I'm talking like the historical.
I know. I agree.
Bloods.
I totally agree, but we shouldn't do that to UConn
So,
anymore.
UNC and Duke, obviously, their coaches retired and they had internal candidates. Bill Self took the KU job in 2003. So we're talking over 20 years since that job was open. So this sort of thing doesn't come available much. And, I think the thing that ultimately this is going to come down to that neither you or I or anybody, unless you are Scott Drew himself, knows is his motivations and his priorities and what drives him. There could potentially be, and there might very well be, a priority or a motivation in Scott Drew's mind to not only be at the very top of the mountain at the university that you built, but to go to one of the all-time powerhouses with guys like Adolph Rupp and others that helped build the sport to be at the pinnacle, the elite of the elite programs to finish out your career. I think that there definitely could be a strong motivation to do that. Yeah, you could win another championship at Baylor. You sure can. You absolutely can. As we were talking last night, you said that really the only thing that Kentucky can basically guarantee to a coach outside of the money and all of that is you're basically, for the most part, guaranteed to get a top 3 seed in the NCAA tournament consistently. Okay. So, but by that logic, any coach that's consistently doing that already at their program, like Scott Drew is at Baylor, shouldn't even be interested in the Kentucky job. But there's a lot more of a motivation to play into that because of just from a legacy perspective. So I do think that those are things that he's going to have to wrestle with if Kentucky knocks on his door. But I do think he absolutely should take that job.
Well, let me clarify, because I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that you get a top 3 seed at Kentucky every year. You could go to Kentucky and fail, right? Like, that's possible. What I mean, my point is, like, Kentucky doesn't give Scott Drew a better chance to win a national championship, is my point. He's already in a position to contend for a national championship every year. So I don't think going to Kentucky elevates his chances to win national championships. They'll certainly pay more money, and they will, be at a platform that is desirable. I get it. I get all that part of it. I'm not discounting any of that. I just think there are a few places where guys aren't going. For most coaches in this search, right? You go to Kentucky because you feel like it gives you the best chance to win a national championship, right? Like that you see that and you're like, okay, but for the 2 guys that I've mentioned, I don't think that's true, because I think they're in a good position to win a national championship every year. Anyway, they're already getting these players.
They are. And, I think Scott Drew is as well. Like, I think that Scott, but there is a legitimate difference between winning a national championship at Baylor and winning a national championship at Kentucky.
For everybody else, I agree, but maybe not for Scott Drew. And so his is unique. His is unique because he is one of the few people at a place where it's his, right? He built this. I akin it last night to Bill Snyder at K-State. Like, there is something to having a stadium named after you,
sure,
and having statues of you, like, to being the person that created this. Like, to me, that's hard to walk away from.
You
no matter
also
what.
asked me you asked me in the context of Bill Snyder, and I think it's a perfect comparison. In the context of Bill Snyder, you asked me, like, should Bill Snyder have taken another job? Well, it depends on the job that he was being offered, and I did some research, and we were talking about it last night. In Bill Snyder's book, he says he names 2 programs that actually offered him jobs, UCLA and Arkansas. Those were the two programs at the time that offered him jobs sometime in the 90s. So knowing that,
I wonder.
no, I wouldn't take one of those jobs if I was Bill Snyder. I would stay.
Yeah.
But
How
if
many
Ohio
actually
State calls
offered him
you,
versus thought he'd be interested?
if Ohio State calls Bill Snyder, or Notre Dame calls Bill Snyder, or Oklahoma or Nebraska in the 90s calls Bill Snyder, it might be a different conversation at that point.
It could be. We'll never know that answer, right? My point is legacies, no matter what Dan Hurley does at UConn, right? That's going to be Jim Calhoun's to have built, right? Jim Calhoun will be the guy. No matter what anybody does at Kentucky, nobody's ever taken that away from Adolph Rupp, right? Kansas is in the same boat. Bill Self's probably is the most successful Kansas coach there ever has been. But when you look at the history of Kansas basketball, it's going to go back because they didn't build it. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just the reality there. You don't get many chances.
They're the caretakers of these programs.
Right.
There's nothing wrong with that. And I mentioned to you as we were talking last night, I mentioned to you, I remember when Bill Self in his introductory press conference, the very first time that, he was introduced to the crowd and the fan base as being the new coach, he said he had always dreamed about having an office on Naismith Drive. That motivated him. He to work for a program, a university that invented the game. The rules, the original rules of the game are there. The arena is named after Fog Allen. So like that was special to him. That meant something to him. He could have absolutely won national titles at Illinois, 100%. They went to a national championship game 2 years after Bill Self left with a lot of Bill Self's players at Illinois. He could, but it was different at a program like Kansas in the same way that Scott Drew going to Kentucky from Baylor would be different for him. Not necessarily more impactful, but different.
Bill Self didn't build Illinois.
They
right?
weren't
like he was just there for a second.
And they weren't
I know,
great
but
they
were
a long
there.
time.
I'd have to go back and look at the history. How long was he in Illinois?
He was there for 3 years. He replaced Lon Kruger. Kruger had a little bit of success there, but it's not like they had this long time standard of great basketball.
He didn't ever have what not, and again, almost nobody does have what Scott Drew has right now. So, and again, I'm just trying to put myself in his situation. I don't know what motivates him. There are also nuances to this. Think about these things that could be going through your head too, right? Forever, you've never wanted to leave Baylor because you built this. Well, now there is a caretaker that you would certainly approve of for Baylor if you were to take that step. That could be a motivating factor, legitimately. If you knew that Jerome Tang would come in and take over things for you, right? Or Grant McCasland or whoever it is, okay, I'd be more comfortable stepping away knowing that that's there. That could be a factor. I'm not saying it is.
And
I'm
by
just saying
the way,
it could be.
I'm not sure that there is a better active coach in college basketball that has done a better job building a coaching tree right now than Scott Drew. Like you look at the assistants under Calipari, you look at the assistants under Krzyzewski, under Bill Self. I think Scott Drew has them all beat as far as the success of other coaches that have coached under Scott Drew that have now went out and had a ton of success in coaching. So then that harkens back to to days of old when you had these legendary coaches with legendary coaching trees. Scott Drew is kind of that modern example of that.
So here's the other thing that would worry me if I was Scott Drew. If I had, at Baylor, I am a legend. I am revered. I am the GOAT. I'm all these things. If you have the exact same amount of success at Kentucky that you've had at Baylor, you're run out of town. That's also a factor because it's not, for a long time, Scott Drew was the guy that could never get it done. Scott Drew has been bounced out of the NCAA tournament in the opening weekend the last 3 years. And you had a championship in there, right? But he's been a first weekend tournament loser 4, 5, 6, 7 times.
I get it, but then it brings up the question of can he, with larger resources at Kentucky, have even more success than he had at Baylor? I think probably yes.
That's a part of my problem too. Larger resources, yes, but not better players. He's not going to have better players at Kentucky than he's had at Baylor. He's had some of the best players in the country. He's had NBA guys. He's had the high recruiting classes. He's had all that at Baylor. So you're going to have to achieve far more success at Kentucky than you've achieved at Baylor for this to work if you're Scott Drew. That's another deterrent for me. Like all this amazing success, we tip our caps. We talk about how remarkable a job and great a coach he is at Baylor right now. If he does the exact same thing at Kentucky, he'll be run out of town.
But here's the other thing, too, that I think plays into this. And you talked about a lot of nuances, and it's what makes this discussion so fascinating. Scott Drew has a national championship win. Okay. Do you put him on the Mount Rushmore of coaches of all time? Probably not. I don't, at least not right now.
Absolutely not.
He's not up there with Coach K. He's not up there with Roy Williams. He's not up there with Bobby Knight. He's not up there with, some of the all-time Adolph Rupp and like all of these other guys. Okay. Right now, I would put Scott Drew in the same category of other coaches that are really good or really great coaches, but not on the Mount Rushmore of legacy all-time greats. I'd put him up there with like Gary Williams at Maryland, for example. Like some of these Tom Izzo. I think Tom Izzo's a great coach. I don't think Tom Izzo is on the Mount Rushmore of all-time coaches. He's got a national championship. I don't think he's on the Mount Rushmore. There are like Tubby Smith, for example, not on the Mount Rushmore. He's got a national championship. But I think that if Scott Drew goes to Kentucky and wins at least one more national title, if not more, then absolutely you can start to have that conversation about Scott Drew being on the Mount Rushmore. Absolutely you can.
But you just said if he wins 1 in 15 years, that's not good enough.
I said that
so he's going to have to win. How many is he going to have to win to get on Mount Rushmore?
1 in 15 years is Calipari. He's going to
right.
I think that Scott Drew. I mean, let's see. He's 53. You're probably looking at. Let's just say
puts him at 68.
So let's just say 15. Let's say 20 years. He's got 20 more years in coaching. Okay, and let's say that he spends the remainder of those 20 years at Kentucky. You leave Kentucky after 20 years and you win 2 more championships in 20 years. I think that puts you among the all-time greats.
I'm pretty sure 2 championships in 20 years is barely the standard of winning at Kentucky. So that may not be good enough to last 20 years, because John Calipari had 1 in 15. It wasn't good enough. I know. But Scott Drew, so what if he wins 2 more championships over the next 20 years at Baylor? Because he's at Baylor, you don't put him on the same Mount Rushmore?
I think it's different to win a championship at a blue blood than it is to win a championship at a place like Baylor.
Don't you think it makes you a better coach to win one at a non-blue blood than it does at a blue blood?
It's not about being a better coach. I'm talking about the most like legacy, all time. Do you put Jim Calhoun on the Mount Rushmore?
He's in the conversation.
Is he on the Mount? Like I'm talking about the top 4. Like, would you put Jim Calhoun in there? He's won 3 at a non-blue blood, non-traditional blue blood.
So don't ask me my Mount Rushmore because it's about more than championships. But yes, I would. For me, and I've got to go with guys I watched, right? Because John Wooden's going to be there. I never saw John Wooden coach. I have to, like, of my personal Mount Rushmore, if you're telling me of my lifetime, the 4 college basketball coaches for me, it would be probably Roy Williams, Bill Self, Jim Calhoun. I don't know.
Coach K?
Like I would really have to look
at put Coach K on there?
And Coach K. Yeah, and Coach K.
Okay.
And then Izzo and Boeheim are probably runners up to that, right? So I just think that if you can achieve the same things at Baylor, and I think that you can, as far as winning championships, I think that he can. To me, there's too much risk involved in going to a place where the standard is unreasonably high, because I do think it's unreasonably high. Now, if you're anybody else, I would take the job, right? I don't think Scott Drew wouldn't be my top choice if I was Kentucky. Let me make that clear. Here's the other thing about Scott Drew. Again, about what you've built at Baylor and worked so hard for. Scott Drew has won a Big 12 championship outright 1 time in 20 years. He has been, at or tied for first 2 times in 20 years. He's only been second or better 5 times in 20 years in his conference. So that's going to be,
I think that's okay. So I think that in response to that, that's cherry picking a little bit, because you have to remove like the first 5 years from Scott Drew because of how bad that program how bad a shape it was in, the scholarship restrictions. I mean, all the different NCAA violations. Okay. So you have to take that away first off. But then on top of that, I think context is key. Baylor ran up against a blue blood powerhouse in Kansas in their conference every single year. And, that during the stretch of time when Kansas was winning Big 12 conference championships every single year for 14, 15 years in a row. So I think that you remove Kansas, you remove Bill Self from that picture, and all of a sudden Scott Drew and Baylor, they become the best program in the Big 12 year in and year out. Year in and year out consistently.
Do you know how many times John Calipari has not finished in the top 2 of the SEC over his 15 years? Has not done it.
4 times?
Twice.
Okay.
Twice. 3 times. Sorry, 3 times.
Okay.
I just so you're elevating your standard of winning. Also, by the way, at Kentucky, John Calipari won 77% of his games. 77%. Okay, Scott Drew over the totality is at about 65%. So if you do wipe clean those
take
first
away
4
those
years,
first
and
few years.
I'm willing to give you that. It's still probably not even 70%. So you're not winning as many regular season games. You're certainly not finishing in your conference as as much as Cal has, and you essentially have the same number of championships over that period of time. You do have the same number of championships over that period of time. The fans there are telling you that what Cal did is not good enough. Cal has been more successful at Kentucky over the last 15 years than Scott Drew has been at Baylor over the last 15 years.
So unless Kentucky, by that logic, unless Kentucky is willing to just back up the Brinks truck and beg and plead, get down on their knees and grovel for Billy Donovan or Dan Hurley, I think that it's a situation where at that point, and neither one of those guys are realistic, there's not a better option for Kentucky to go after than Scott Drew. There's just not.
Oh, well, Kentucky can go after whoever they want. I'm looking at the other side of it on whether the coach should go there. Kentucky can go get anybody. That I'm not talking about from the perspective of Kentucky. I'm talking about from the perspective of Scott Drew. Kentucky can get anybody that they want. I don't, that's a decision. And we'll talk about that in our next segment. Who should they go after? I'm talking just about Scott Drew making the decision to leave Baylor to go there. I don't think that there is enough upside when I feel like he's got as good a chance to win a championship at Baylor than Kentucky. I just think the standard for him is not one that's attainable. Outside of Mark Few, everybody else on the list, I will tell you, has a better chance to win championships at Kentucky than wherever they are currently, right? No matter where they are. Outside of Baylor and Gonzaga, where I think those guys are so established, they're going to get whatever players they want. Everybody else has a better chance to win national championships at Kentucky, so you can go to Kentucky. I would go to Kentucky. I'm just saying for those two guys, I don't think that exists. And that's why I'm interested in Scott Drew. The other thing is, does Kentucky want Scott Drew? Like, is he their guy? We don't know that either, right? Like, his agent wants us to think that Kentucky wants Scott Drew. I have no idea who Kentucky wants, other than they probably would have loved to have Dan Hurley. Outside of that, and now we think Nate Oates. Nate Oates coming out and saying that tells us they probably talked to Nate Oates and like, well, we're not doing your buyout. Sorry, buddy. So we have an indication at least that those two guys were on the list. We don't even know if Scott Drew's on their top candidate list right now. We don't know that. At least I haven't seen that outside of, agent reporting.
And by the way, something that I think is really interesting to keep our eyes on, and this has been reported, I think Pete Thamel from ESPN was the first to report this. If this search drags on, today is the 9th of April. If this search drags on for a while, at that point, you start to think that Billy Donovan might actually be legitimate, because he's got the Bulls playing in the play-in tournament. So they can't even talk to him, I think, until the 17th is like the first day that they can actually have a conversation with him. So if something happens soon, it's not going to be Billy Donovan. If there's not a new coach in place and this goes on for a week or longer, then that could lend a little bit of credibility to the fact that Billy Donovan is interested in coming back from the pros.
Billy Donovan's fascinating. Unless he just really wants to return to college basketball. If he wants to return to college basketball, this obviously makes the most sense. He's not going to make more money.
I wouldn't want to do that. I would not.
No way. I'd be like, get out of here. Like, you want me to go deal with that? No, thank you. Not doing that anymore. But his name is fascinating, and it's fascinating to me whether you're better served to bring back an older guard guy who hasn't dealt with the things that college basketball coaches now deal with.
Hey, why don't they give the job? Hey, real quick, why don't they give the job to Pitino for a couple of years until Nado's buyout drops?
Which Pitino? Which Pitino?
Rick Pitino.
I actually like Richard Pitino for that job more than I like Rick Pitino for that job. What has Rick Pitino done? We're going to pause here. We're going to pause, and we'll go back to this in just a second. We'll get back to that in a minute. Man, what a fascinating time in college basketball. On the way out, we want to tell you about tonight coming up. You've got the Wichita State baseball coaches show tonight. That's at 5:45. No, sorry, I'm a dummy. Tonight you have Wichita State baseball taking on Oklahoma State. That's what you have for
Riverfront
Wichita State
Stadium,
baseball. That's at 5:45. Yeah, this is a big one. This is the Riverfront game, and it also just happens to fall in when you get Wichita State, Oklahoma softball. So big night for the Shockers. Wanted to mention that real quick. We're going to come back. Who should Kentucky go after? Scott Drew, all things considered, is Tommy's top choice. He's not mine. He's probably in my top 4, but he's not in my top. I'll tell you who is, and Tommy can react to it when we come back on Sports Daily. All right, welcome back here to KFH. Open Streets ICT this Sunday at Wichita State from 12 to 4. Check it out. That's Wichita State and Shocker neighborhood. You can join KNSS and Odyssey Radio for Open Streets ICT. It's a free community building event bringing Wichitans of all ages and fitness levels together to promote healthy, active living and social engagement. We're talking not Big 12, although it does pertain to the Big 12, kind of in a large way. This Kentucky job opening. So we have gone through. We can cross Nate Oates off. We can cross Jay Wright off. We can cross, we think, Dan Hurley off the list. That leaves everybody else. Tommy's top choice at that point would be Scott Drew, who is the betting favorite. He wouldn't be, and we've discussed at great length whether he should take that job if it was offered to him. Now let's switch to who should they offer it to. Scott Drew's your choice. I think he's a great choice. He wouldn't be my top choice. If I'm Kentucky and I'm shooting for the moon and wondering who the next great coach there, the guy that could really take them where they want to go. This is not a homer thing to say, and it's something that people are going to get mad at me for saying, but don't misunderstand why I'm saying it. This is a compliment, and I hope it never happens. But Jerome Tang would be at the top of my list. Now, that's not going to happen.
Been waiting an hour and a half for you to say that.
Right. That's not going to happen because he hasn't been a head coach long enough, and they didn't even make the NCAA tournament. They'd never be able to sell that higher to the fan base. I do think he would be the best fit there. When I think about what it will take to elevate Kentucky to this level of success that John Calipari apparently wasn't doing, you have to begin with in-game coaching first and foremost. In a short time span, I think Tang has shown us he's really good in game. He beats Scott Drew all the time. He's had enough success against Bill Self. He had the tournament run last year. Their roster wasn't very good this year.
He beat Calipari in Kentucky. Remember that?
Right. Yes. So I think he's done it. Like, for me, he's done enough. And then it's all the other stuff, of course, that people would fall in love with. He would continue to get the best players. So, like, as far as like best fit, he would actually be there for me. So then, and it's not going to be him. So it won't. You need to be more concerned, K-State fans, about Scott Drew and then the Baylor job opening. So then if I'm going down the list and I could cherry pick it, it depends on what you're looking for. If I'm going to like find the best in-game coach to win games, blah, 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 I would start with Kelvin Sampson. Although at 68, that would knock him down for me. I'd go to Brad Underwood next. Brad Underwood has done it in a couple of different places. He's been successful a couple of different places. You continually give him the best players, and I think he'd have a ton of success, and I think he'd be great there. And then after Brad Underwood, I'd probably go to Chris Beard. Again, same thing, done it at a few different places in Ole Miss. It's been too early. And then I'd go to Scott Drew. So he'd be in my top, what is that, 4? I think it is. But he wouldn't be my top guy. And that'll be interesting to see. Like, does Kentucky, do they cave to a fan base here? Your scenario of Rick Pitino to let Nate Oates' contract run out is an interesting one, although Alabama's going to be able to, if they need to, pay Nate Oates whatever Kentucky can over time, I would think, with the resources at that university. I think Richard Pitino's pretty interesting. Because Richard Pitino, you have no doubt about getting him there, all those things. You've got the legacy. That's kind of cool. He's been successful.
He hasn't
but
done
he's not
enough.
The sexiest
he hasn't done anything.
I know.
I mean, he's at New Mexico.
He's not sexy enough.
Yeah.
But that's where Kentucky's under a lot of pressure here as the administration. Like, you can't make this hire based on who everyone thinks would be the best. You have to make the hire on who you think will be the best long term. And that will be what's interesting about this hire for me, is what things do they value in this coach? Is it an older coach that's established? Is it a younger coach that's an up-and-comer like Jerome Tang, who's, maybe not younger by age, but younger by career? Is it a real wild card like Richard Pitino, quite frankly? So I don't, this is going to be interesting to see what they do, because Dan Hurley was the obvious choice. Now that because I wouldn't have gone, Jay Wright, I wouldn't have hired anyway. Nate Oates, I would have been all on board with Nate Oates. Nate Oates and Chris Beard are sort of interchangeable to me. Brad Underwood fits a different profile. Jerome Tang is the total flyer, profile. But we were just willing to say, you and I joked, and I think I brought this up yesterday. Had Tang gone to Arkansas, my joke was, well, he'll just be the Kentucky coach in 2 years when Cal's done, right? So if he's good enough in 2 years to be at Kentucky, he's good enough now for me. Like that. So again, that's not going to happen. I wouldn't worry about that. K-State fans worry about Scott Drew. I just don't know what Kentucky values here.
Yeah, I mean,
what they're looking for.
Make no mistake about it. I mean, I think that we both would agree that if Jerome Tang got that call and he went to Kentucky, he would kill it. He would kill it.
He would kill it.
It's not going to happen, and it's not anything that I would be concerned about as far as him going directly to Kentucky, because they're not going to take that kind of risk, I don't think, on a hire. Even though I think that generally speaking, everybody has this idea that he's really fantastic. Some of the other names, you mentioned Kelvin Sampson. He's phenomenal. He's done wonderful things.
I think he's the best in-game coach. Well, now outside of Dan Hurley.
But here's
so I'll call him the second best in-game coach in the country.
The thing about Kelvin Sampson, and it's a lot of is due to his age, but you talked about how Scott Drew doesn't need Kentucky at Baylor. Kelvin Sampson really doesn't need Kentucky when he's at Houston. Like if that's the argument for Scott Drew to not do it, Kelvin Sampson definitely doesn't need Kentucky. I mean, he could do it at Houston. He absolutely could do it at Houston.
Yeah. He can. I don't know that
at all.
I don't know that I would imply the same level of recruiting necessarily, although he's been phenomenal in the portal, so maybe he should be. I would give Baylor a slight recruiting advantage over what we've seen over time than Sampson's kind of done it with a group that has lasted a long time. Baylor's done it with
Brad
a ton
Underwood.
Of different guys.
Brad Underwood is a really good coach. He's done really good things at Illinois. To me, that doesn't move the needle. And Chris Beard is kind of the same way. The thing about that it would concern me about Chris Beard is that he's had a tendency throughout his entire career to job hop, and go place to place.
He didn't have the choice to leave Texas.
Well, Texas excluded, but Texas Tech, he bounced pretty quickly. He was like the UNLV.
That's the only time.
He was the UNLV coach for like a week. And then he left to go to Texas Tech. Like he was there like briefly, and then he went to Texas Tech. So he's had a tendency to job hop a little bit throughout the course of his career. That would concern me. There's not a great history in Kentucky of you getting former Texas Tech coaches. Look at Billy Gillespie. That didn't work out very well for Kentucky. So I don't know if that's really a direction they're going to go.
It's been good the other direction with Tubby Smith.
Yeah, it's been
There's
fun.
a lot of connections there between Tech and Kentucky, oddly.
I don't know. I think that for me, like I understand the appeal of a coach like Kelvin Sampson because he's phenomenal. I'm just not sure there's really a need for him to go and do that.
No, I don't. I agree. I totally agree. I don't think Kelvin Sampson would do it. I'm just saying, like, if I could pick my ideal candidate, because when I think of like actual in-game coaches, I think you have Dan Hurley, and then I think you have Kelvin Sampson, and then probably Bill Self. Well, Bill Self and Dan Hurley aren't going anywhere. So then there's Kelvin Sampson. I don't think he should, nor do I think they need to be in the business of hiring a 68-year-old coach, which is why Rick Pitino seems ridiculous to me, but whatever. Brad Underwood's 60. So he's older, a little longer in the tooth, but I think still plenty motivated to do this another 8 to 10 years. His career's really interesting. He was incredible at Stephen F. Austin. Now, I guess they vacated some. I don't even know that happened. I don't know what that's all about. He was good at Oklahoma State for a very brief time. That got really weird, you might remember. And then at Illinois, it took him a couple of years, but they've been good too. They made it, they're farthest this year. But he fits a profile to me of a guy who's been successful everywhere. But when you talk about Kentucky for him, you're going to talk about an elevation in the caliber of player he has, right? And he had that this year, and they made the Elite Eight. But he would benefit there, and so maybe Scott Drew should be higher on that list. I don't know what it is. I think I can't.
I'd put Scott Drew above Brad Underwood. Not a knock on Underwood. I like Underwood, but I would put Scott Drew.
I'll listen to that. I've got them on par. I mean, I think Chris Beard has always impressed me as a coach, like a lot as a coach. And he probably, like, and again, that's just like a gut thing. I don't think he would job hunt Kentucky.
Right. I do think, and you're talking about, like, you bring up Jerome Tang, like being a really interesting name if Kentucky wants to take a flyer. I think we both agree that's not going to happen. But if Scott Drew is the odds-on favorite to go to Kentucky, then the Baylor job's going to open. Who's the odds-on favorite to go to Baylor? Is it Jerome Tang or is it Grant McCasland?
Yes.
I mean, there are a handful
No,
of other coaches that have been, associated. We talked about that coaching tree. Paul Mills comes from the Scott Drew coaching tree. Could they take a swing at Paul Mills to go to Baylor?
Nah, he hadn't won enough.
Or, I mean, could you just work your way down that coaching tree? And if Jerome Tang decides he loves Manhattan and wants to stay there, and Grant McCasland decides he loves Lubbock and wants to stay there, at what point do you call a Paul Mills? At what point, like, how far down the list, do you have to look? I know a lot of that
coaching tree.
I know a lot of dominoes have to fall for that sort of thing to happen, but you never know.
Yeah, you wouldn't have to go to that coaching tree at that point. Like, you could just go elsewhere. It's a great job. It's a great job. Where's Driscoll now? He was like the first of that group that was having success. But I don't think Paul Mills has won enough yet to. I mean, he needs that job. He needs a couple of years to make
Driscoll's at North Florida.
Candidate. He's still at North Florida. He's been there, but I just remember his name as one of those guys.
The guy from Florida, the new coach from Florida Atlantic, is a Scott Drew guy.
There you go. Maybe that's who I'm thinking. Yeah. But he's cemented now. He's not doing that. So Tang will be the top guy, and then it would be McCasland, I would think. And neither one of those guys may take the job because they're cemented in the Big 12. I don't know. I don't know how much love they have for their time there versus the university itself. We know, obviously, that Jerome Tang's faith is very important to him. Going to a parochial school would make some sense in that degree, but he's got a lot of that in Manhattan, certainly. This is going to be fascinating. I don't know what Kentucky should do. I told you what I would do. I'd call Jerome Tang. That's what I would do if I was Kentucky. They're not going to do that. Not unless this goes real sideways on them anyway. And then, there are going to be a lot of coaches that get calls here, Tommy, that have already leveraged these jobs too, which we talked about last night, which would be, this is a little unprecedented, right? The double leverage, right? Can coaches take a double raise out of this when Kentucky comes open? It's unique because Kentucky came open late and it came open under unique circumstances, as a lot of these guys have already leveraged their jobs. So we'll see. A 1-to-1 odds just about everywhere you look tells you something, right? Because agents do this all the time. There's something there for sure with Scott Drew.
I don't think that's a leverage thing. I think it would be for some other coaches, but if you're 1-to-1 odds everywhere, I don't think it's a leverage play.
There has to be some connection there or some reason. And there are a lot of reasons on both sides for Scott Drew to take that job and not take that job, which is why I'm so interested. But I don't think he's actually at the top of Kentucky's list. I think they have to work through some other things first, but it's getting to the point where he would probably be near the top, you'd think, if Hurley and Wright, depending on Billy Donovan, if all those guys are out, then yeah, I mean, it's going to start to land in that area. I think the other thing with odds that we have to remember, and I know we're up against it, Max, is that I think a lot of time the odds are cooking in the chances and the likelihoods of somebody actually leaving, right? It's not like the odds are it's not like a ranking of what Kentucky wants. It's a ranking, I think, of the likelihood of the candidates to take the job. So keep that in mind as well. We'll watch this all week. I can't imagine they don't have this figured out by the end of the week, unless, like you said, it's Billy Donovan. I don't think they would wait that long, though, and that may keep him out of it to begin with. He wouldn't be anywhere near my top choice. I love Billy Donovan. He's one of the great college coaches ever. Just why would he do it? All right, 869-1240. We'll come back. And we'll have more on Sports Daily next. Hear this.
Go ahead. I think I want to hear this.
Sports Daily is on KFH.
All right, welcome back in Sports Daily, everybody. Anthony chimes in on our video stream. Thanks for watching that on us on Facebook, YouTube, or X. He says, give Greg Marshall a call for the Kentucky job. Anthony, a friend of the program. I don't think
not gonna happen,
Anthony.
Not gonna happen.
I don't think that's where Kentucky's headed with that one. It's been a minute. It'll be curious to see if when the buyout ends for Greg Marshall, if he has any interest in even getting back in the game. I think we have to answer that question first and foremost, but it won't be at Kentucky if it's going to happen. We'll watch it. You mentioned that a lot of top guys are saying it's not going to be Donovan. They don't want to wait. That would make sense to me. I wouldn't wait if I were them either, not with the transfer portal era in full swing. I don't think you can afford to wait, quite frankly. So that would take him down, and that sort of leaves that next mix that we've talked about a little bit. The question will be, do they go with an established guy or do they take a risk? Do they take a swing for the fences on this? And I don't, if you like Nate Oates and you have any indication that he'd be interested, I think either of those paths you could make some sense of. I think you could take a larger risk with your choice, or you could bring in an older guy that may be a short-term fix. I think both are on the table if you think Oates would take the job in 2 years anyway.
Well, and I think that's the big question, is that I kind of dangled out that thought of a placeholder for a couple of years until the buyout drops. But if you love Nate Oates enough, you just pay the buyout. You're Kentucky. You can afford it.
It's true.
Right? So,
but he is a bit of an insurance policy, don't you think?
Well, sure, I get it. I mean, you could have somebody, kind of be a placeholder, but then what happens in a couple of years if he's not interested anymore, or like
that's the risk
you're running that risk. Like if you really like him enough, strike while the iron is hot and get him now and pay that buyout. Right.
I mean, the best case scenario is that you get that pick right. Kentucky's going to take who they think is. I don't know that this is a spot where they're going to feel any pressure. It's not like they fired Cal. They'll always have that to fall back on.
I think they'll feel pressure. Cal. I think you inevitably feel pressure in that program.
The normal amount of pressure, though. Yeah. I think there would have been more pressure had they fired Cal to go say, we've got to try to, we got to be able to win right away. I do think they have a tiny ounce of wiggle room to give it a year. You know what I mean? Whereas if they fired Cal, they're telling you, no, it's got to be better. Well, they can at least say, no, we didn't fire him. We're trying to build this thing up again. We'll see. I don't know what they're going to do. Scott Drew makes a lot of sense. It's on Scott Drew's table, probably. We'll follow it because it pertains to Jerome Tang, dadgummit. I mean, it just does, quite frankly. So we'll watch it. 869-1240. We're going to come back. We'll tell you what's on the network when we return and wrap up Sports Daily.
I'm attorney Tyler Patterson. Patterson Legal Group helps hundreds of people each year with their car wreck cases. That's a lot of checks for a lot of happy people. And as our way of saying thanks, we're committed to making Kansas a better place for everyone. Over the years, we've donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to local nonprofits in the community. When you hire Patterson Legal Group, you're not just getting a team of legal professionals, you're helping make Kansas a better place for everyone.
Patterson Legal is the way to go. Call 550-0000.
Save big money on supplies for your next project. Now at Menards. From simple paint protection to heavy-duty construction, Polar Plastics has a solution for any project. 10 by 25-foot rolls of all-purpose plastic drop cloth are on sale now through April 14th. Save big on Polar Plastics at Menards. And don't forget to check out our flyer on menards.com for all the great deals happening now.
Save big money at Menards.
Line-X of Wichita is now Truckworks ICT. New name, new spray and bed liner, same great service. We'll be having a grand reopening sale in May with discounts on most products and services. Truckworks ICT, 167 South Washington Street, 316-858-3790.
Join us at Odyssey as we all do our one thing, together millions of things for our planet. Earth Day is April 22nd. During the spring and summer, hang your clothes outside to dry instead of using the dryer. What's your one thing?
Spring into savings at Maximum Outdoor Equipment and Service. For a limited time, get up to 25% off select models, including Husqvarna, Grasshopper, Ferris, Toro, and Steel. These deals won't last long, so hurry in today for the best selection. Don't wait. Spring into savings and get up to 25% off Husqvarna, Grasshopper, Ferris, Toro, and Steel at Maximum Outdoor. South of 21st and Andover Road or south of Kellogg on West Street or MaximumOutdoor.com. We know mowers.
Maximum Outdoor Equipment.
It's the 16th Annual Independent Living Resource Center Golf Classic at Sand Creek Station in Newton, Friday, May 10th. We welcome players of all abilities and promise a great day of golf at one of the best courses in Kansas. The tournament starts at noon with lunch before and a steak dinner after the tournament and beverages. There'll be awards and chances to win great prizes along with a live auction. Proceeds from the tournament benefit ILRC's Greater Expectations Autism Program for young adults with autism. For more about the tournament, visit ilrcks.org.
eBay Motors is here for the ride. 120,000 miles of night drives, daily commutes, and who knows how many.
Are we there yet?
Through countless fixes, elbow grease, and a new radiator, you kept your ride alive. With eBay Motors, you have over 122 million parts to keep it running. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, they'll be the perfect fit every time. Plus, at these prices, well, we're burning rubber, not cash. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply.
Every business faces challenges, but complicated, expensive, and uncertain shipping shouldn't be one of them.
With USPS Ground Advantage from the United States Postal Service, you can avoid all the noise.
No more unexpected surcharges, hidden fees, or complex rate structures.
It's just easy, cost-effective, and dependable shipping. Tune your business's frequency to success and turn shipping to your advantage. Learn how at USPS.com/advantage. USPS Ground Advantage. Simple, affordable, reliable.
The KFH Studios, powered by Devon James Injury Lawyers. Call 888-8888. That's 888-8888.
College men's basketball last night, the championship game of the NCAA tournament. Connecticut beats Purdue 75-60. Back-to-back national titles for UConn, winning 13 straight to finish up the season with a record of 37-3. One of those three losses, in fact, the first one, came more than 4 months ago when fourth-ranked Connecticut lost at fifth-ranked Kansas in Lawrence, 69-65. One of only three losses on the season for national champion Connecticut. College softball, Wichita State hosting the number one ranked team in the nation, Oklahoma, the three-time defending national champions. That game at 6 o'clock this evening at Wilkins Stadium. Shockers have lost 41 straight against the Sooners. Oklahoma comes in leading the nation in batting average, fielding percentage, on-base percentage, and walks. The Shockers are in the top 5 in the nation in home runs per game. The Shockers and the Sooners, 6 o'clock tonight at Wilkins Stadium on the Wichita State campus for softball action. I'm Ted, the Sports Head.
Wichita's most listened to sports radio, 97.5 and 1240 KFH.
All right, that's it for us. Thanks for being here, everybody. Thanks to Max for filling in for Tommy. We'll have Max for about a week here as Chad gets a little time off. Again, you heard Ted just now mentioning it. You've got the Oklahoma State Shocker Baseball Riverfront Stadium, all the good and excitement stuff right here on KFH. You can also listen to that on the Odyssey app. And also keep an eye on Wichita State softball taking on Juggernaut Oklahoma. Regular programming otherwise, including Bob and Jeff locally 2 to 4. Tommy, we'll see if Kentucky has a coach tomorrow.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to keep an eye on. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
Sounds good. For Max and Tommy, I'm Jacob. See you then.